Hey, welcome back to 5 and 25. This is episode 3. We picked 25 chapters of the Bible. If you know these 25 chapters, you'll know the storyline from beginning to end. We took a pretty big jump here. We jumped 19 chapters. In episode 2, we were in Genesis chapter 2, and now we've jumped, or Genesis 3, now we've jumped to Genesis chapter 22. So those of you who are familiar with the Bible, we've skipped a few stories: Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark, Tower of Babel, and the miraculous birth of Isaac for Abraham and Sarah. Now, when we get to Genesis 22, it's kind of a troubling way to start out. If you're new to the Bible and you've never read this story before, you'd be like, what is going on? Because God, he's testing Abraham, and he tells him to go sacrifice his son, go kill his son. And especially if you've read the chapters up to this, you're like, what is going on? So a lot of times when I'm having discussions with this with others, people are wondering, well, what's Isaac thinking as he's carrying the wood up? And what's Abraham thinking as he's going? So there's a lot of questions that may come up about this, but what we want you to focus on are a few big ideas of this chapter. Now, the first big idea is the idea of faith. So faith and Abraham gives it a great example of faith is he trusts God even though he doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. And he just believes that God's good, and he's going to obey God anyway. And so that's pretty amazing, especially in the circumstances that he's in here. If you note what he says to the servants when they start heading up the mountain. It appears that he thinks that somehow they're both going to come back, and whatever's going to happen. And later in Hebrews, it suggests that Abraham thought that God could even raise people from the dead if he needed to continue and fulfill his promise. The other word, you're going to see fear. Abraham's going to be affirmed because he fears God. Now, in the Bible, just so you know, that's a positive thing. We use the phrase sometimes in our culture that a person is God-fearing, and usually that's used in a positive way. So when the Bible says that they feared God, that's a positive term. All right, the idea of prophecy. Okay, I want to show you this because in this passage, there's a prophecy that you got to get. You got to understand this if you're going to understand the rest of the Bible. So God's going to make this promise to Abraham, and it's right at the end of the chapter. And you notice he's going to promise him, and he's made this promise in prior chapters too. Abraham, you're going to have this really big family. Now, Abraham was the father of the Jewish race. He is the first Jewish person. So, you know, I know some Jewish people today that are Jewish in their genealogy or in their blood, and Abraham was the very first one. And there have been millions and millions of Jewish people in our world since then. So we see that God, 4,000 years prior, makes this promise, and sure enough, it happened. Also, he promised land to Abraham and to his descendants. And modern-day Israel is where that land is located, and man, there's been a lot of fights over that land since then. And it's interesting that some of Abraham's descendants are still living on that land. And then the third promise is that he's going to bless all the nations through Abraham's family. And as we're going to discover, and most of the Bible is about Abraham's family. As we're going to discover, Jesus ends up being one of the descendants of Abraham's, and we believe Jesus blessed the whole world and every nation and every people group by dying for us. So that's the prophecy that we want to point out. And finally, the idea of foreshadowing. So foreshadowing, it's not as blatant as prophecy, but it points to a future thing that's going to happen. Now, Abraham is up there, he's getting ready to sacrifice Isaac, and God says, stop. And then there's a ram over there that just happens to be up there on the mountain with him and caught. So Abraham gets the ram, he exchanges Isaac, and he sacrifices the ram in his place. So a substitute sacrifice on this mountain. Now, Abraham then turns around and says, he named the mountain. On this mountain the Lord will provide, or it will be provided for. Crazy connection here. This is the mountain that later becomes the city of Jerusalem, and this is where Jesus is sacrificed on the cross 2,000 years later. And I think this is a great picture of a foreshadowing of the coming of Jesus. Now, as we continue in our next episode, we're going to see that Abraham's small family does become a big family, but they're going to end up being slaves in another country, not in this land. And we're going to see what God does about that to fulfill His promises. So see you in the next video. God bless.